What if the way we've been taught to see Viking warfare misses the most important part of the story? How intelligence, not brutality, shaped their victories. What if the people history labeled as savage raiders were, in reality, among the most disciplined military engineers of the early medieval world? What if their violence was never chaos at all, but a form of language, refined through generations of survival? And what if the true source of their dominance was not rage, but precision? For centuries, the northern wind, heavy with salt, cold, and isolation, shaped a society where survival was never guaranteed. In that world, war was not a profession learned by choice. It was not even an occupation. It was a necessity. A direct response to a land that offered little mercy, to seas that could kill without warning, and to neighbors who respected only strength they could not break. To outsiders, the Vikings appeared as a storm. Sudden, violent, uncontrollable. Burning villages, screaming warriors. Axes rising and falling in a blur of blood and fear. But storms, too, follow laws. Beneath the legends lies a truth far more unsettling. Viking warfare was calculated, optimized, repeated, tested, and refined until nothing was left to chance. Every weapon had a purpose. Every movement conserved energy. Every strike aimed not just to kill, but to break will, formation, and resolve. Small bands of northerners did not terrify empires by accident. They did it because they understood something their enemies did not. That war is not won by fury, but by systems. To understand their power, we must abandon the comforting myth that they fought blindly. Because nothing about Viking war was blind. Modern audiences tend to see weapons as objects, tools that exist separately from the hand that holds them. The Vikings did not think this way. To them, a weapon was never isolated. It was a system. Metal, muscle, belief, and environment fused into a single, living mechanism. An axe was not just heavy. It was weighted to harness inertia, to let gravity and motion finish what muscle began. A shield was not built to be rigid. It was designed to flex, to absorb shock, trap blades, and return force back to the attacker. A spear was not merely long. It was a ruler of distance, controlling space with ruthless efficiency long before an enemy could strike back. Nothing existed without intention. Every curve, every edge, every gram of weight served a purpose. And that purpose was tested not in theory, but in blood. Archaeology confirms what the sagas only hinted at. Viking weapons were rarely decorated by accident. Weight distribution, center of gravity, edge geometry. These were not artistic choices. They were battlefield solutions, refined through repetition and survival. A Viking warrior did not shape himself to fit his weapon. The weapon was shaped to fit him. His height, his grip, his stride, his way of moving through violence. This level of customization required more than strength. It demanded observation, experimentation, a deep understanding of how bodies break and how systems endure. And that leads to an unsettling thought. If these weapons were engineered with such precision, what kind of minds were capable of designing them? To the Scandinavian warrior, a weapon was never inert. It was never silent. It was never empty. It had a name, a history, a temperament shaped by fire, ritual, and use. The sagas speak of swords that refused to strike, axes that failed at the moment of truth, and blades that seemed to hunger for battle. To the modern mind, this sounds like superstition. But archaeology and anthropology suggest something far more complex. Naming a weapon was not fantasy. It was a psychological contract. By giving steel a name, the warrior externalized fate, responsibility, and fear. Victory was no longer random. Failure was no longer meaningless. When a man believed his blade carried the strength of his ancestors, his confidence hardened, his grip steadied, his movements became decisive. And when he believed that hesitation would cause his weapon to betray him, hesitation vanished. Weapons were forged with ritualized intent. Charcoal from funeral pyres, bone ash added during carburization. Today, Metallurgy confirms that phosphorus and calcium from bone ash could alter steel properties, increasing hardness, toughness, and resilience. What looked like magic often worked, because it was primitive science guided by belief. The ritual gave meaning. The chemistry gave results. Steel became memory. Memory became confidence. And confidence, on the battlefield, was often the difference between survival and death. To the Viking, a weapon was not something you held. It was something you entered into agreement with. And once that bond was formed, breaking it meant far more than losing a tool. Contrary to popular belief, the sword was not the Vikings' primary weapon. It was not the tool that defined their way of war. The axe did. Above all others stood the Danish axe. Long-handled, thin-bladed, and terrifyingly efficient. This was not a farmer's tool repurposed for violence. It was a purpose-built instrument of war, engineered to dominate space, timing, and momentum. Its elongated beard was no accident. That curved lower edge allowed warriors to hook enemy shields, yank them out of position, and open a lethal gap in the defense. The blade itself was forged thin, not for fragility, but for penetration. Despite its size, the Danish axe was surprisingly light, allowing wide, flowing arcs that generated devastating force through inertia alone. Once in motion, stopping it was nearly impossible. Archaeological and metallurgical studies reveal something even more revealing. Many axe heads were built with a soft iron body, and a hardened steel edge welded directly onto it. This was intentional. The soft iron absorbed shock. The hardened edge retained sharpness. The result was a weapon that could strike shields, helmets, and bone, again and again, without shattering. This was not reckless savagery. This was mechanical intelligence, a deep understanding of materials, stress, and failure. But the axe was not perfect. Its power demanded space. Its reach came at the cost of defense. A warrior wielding a two-handed axe carried no shield. He relied on timing, positioning, and the protection of his comrades. And the Vikings understood this weakness completely. They did not worship the axe blindly. They built entire tactics around its limits. Because true mastery is not knowing what a weapon can do, but knowing exactly when it can fail. The round shield was never meant to be passive protection. It was never designed to simply absorb blows. It was an active weapon. Viking shields were built from softwoods such as linden, pine, or spruce. Materials chosen not for weakness, but for resilience. When struck, these woods flexed. They trapped blades in their fibers instead of shattering apart, creating a brief moment of vulnerability in the attacker. The edge of the shield was reinforced with rawhide. As the leather dried, it tightened, binding the planks into a single, stressed structure capable of absorbing tremendous force. This prevented splitting and allowed the shield to survive repeated impacts. At the center sat the umbo, the iron boss that protected the hand, and turned the shield into a weapon of its own. In close combat, the umbo smashed into faces, crushed noses, and drove enemies backward with bone-rattling force. The shield was pushed, twisted, struck, and leveraged. Defense and offense became indistinguishable. In formation, shields overlapped and locked together, forming a living wall that moved as one body. It advanced. It yielded. It absorbed shock and returned pressure. This shield wall was not static defense. It was mobile pressure, a slow, relentless force that crushed space itself. And it demanded absolute trust. Each warrior depended on the shield beside him. A single failure opened a gap. A single gap invited death. Break the wall, and chaos flooded in. Hold the wall, and even superior numbers collapsed under its weight. In Viking warfare, survival was not individual. It was collective. The most common Viking weapon was also the most lethal. Not the sword, not the axe, the spear. It was cheap to produce, easy to repair, and devastating at distance. Where swords demanded wealth, and axes demanded space, the spear demanded discipline. Its shaft was most often made from ash, a wood prized for its balance of flexibility and strength. Under stress, it bent instead of snapping, absorbing force without failure. Spearheads varied widely in form and purpose. Narrow, hardened points pierced mail and flesh. Broad, leaf-shaped blades tore wounds that bled fast and deep. Winged heads, limited penetration, allowing the weapon to be withdrawn quickly, or used to deflect shields and control an opponent's movement. In formation, spears transformed groups of men into a single, lethal system. A forest of points advanced together, denying space, denying approach, denying survival. In naval combat, the spear controlled the most dangerous moment of all: boarding. It struck across gaps between ships, hooked shields and bodies, and kept enemies at lethal distance, on swaying decks, where footing meant everything. Against cavalry, its effect was absolute. Horses refused to charge into a wall of steel. Momentum died before contact was made. Even myth recognized this supremacy. Odin, the highest of gods, carried not a sword or an axe, but the spear Gungnir, a weapon that never missed its mark. If the axe thrived in chaos, the spear ruled order. It was not dramatic. It was not glorious. It was efficient. And in war, efficiency decides who survives. Swords were rare. They were expensive. They were elite. To carry a sword in the Viking Age was to announce status before a single blow was struck. A good blade could cost the equivalent of multiple farms or an entire herd of cattle. Only kings, elite retainers, and the most successful warriors could afford one. Among these, Carolingian blades stood apart, and above them all were the swords marked Ulfberht, forged from high-quality crucible steel, nearly free of slag and impurities. These blades were centuries ahead of their time. They bent without breaking. They struck without chipping. They remained sharp long after lesser weapons failed. But swords were never wielded carelessly. They were conserved. A sword was too valuable to waste on reckless swings or theatrical blade-to-blade clashes. Such contact damaged edges, shortened the blade's life, and risked catastrophic failure. Instead, strikes were precise. Limbs were targeted. Openings were created with the shield. The shield absorbed blows. The sword finished the fight. This was not the weapon of frenzy. It was the weapon of restraint. Control mattered more than aggression. Timing mattered more than strength. And because of this, losing a sword was not merely inconvenient. It was catastrophic. It meant the loss of wealth, of honor, of lineage. Family swords carried names, histories, and victories. To lose one was to sever a bond stretching across generations. In Viking culture, steel remembered. And when a sword was gone, something irreplaceable went with it. When shields broke and formations collapsed, one weapon remained: the sea axe, a heavy, single-edged knife carried by nearly every free person. Men, and often women as well. It was not a symbol of status. It was not elegant. It was not forgiving. The sea axe was simple, brutal, unavoidable. Its thick spine allowed powerful chopping blows at close range. Its angled tip turned short thrusts into lethal punctures. It did not rely on reach or momentum. It relied on commitment. In grappling distance, where shields tangled, where bodies pressed together, where breath, blood, and panic filled the air, the sea axe decided who lived and who fell. There was no fencing, no space for flourish, no time for hesitation. Strikes were short, direct, aimed at gaps in armor, at thighs, at groins, at throats. The sea axe demanded proximity, and proximity demanded resolve. This was a weapon forged for chaos, for moments when discipline failed, and survival became personal. Yet the sea axe was never far from its owner. Worn horizontally at the belt, drawn in a heartbeat, used daily for work, hunting, and survival. That constant use mattered. The blade became familiar, the weight predictable, the grip instinctive. By the time it was needed in combat, it was already an extension of the hand. That is what made the CX honest. It offered no illusion of control, no promise of safety, only a final truth. In the end, survival belonged to the one willing to step closer. Viking warfare never relied on weapons alone. Steel mattered, but bodies mattered more. To the Vikings, the human body itself was a system. Trained, conditioned, engineered for violence and survival. Rowing was not transportation. It was endurance training. Hours, sometimes days, pulling against wind and waves forged powerful backs, iron grips, and lungs that refused to fail. Wrestling was not sport. It was instruction in leverage, balance, and control. How to use an enemy's weight against him. How to stay standing when the ground betrayed you. Swimming in freezing water was not recreation. It was fear conditioning. Cold shock was learned early, so panic would not appear when lives depended on calm. Before blades ever met, archers controlled the battlefield. Longbows turned open space into a killing field. Arrows shattered formations, wounded leaders, and broke morale long before hand-to-hand combat began. This was not random violence. It was preparation layered upon preparation. Pain was expected. It was not dramatized. It was endured. Fear was not denied. It was trained out, through repetition, exposure, and belief. Enemies wrote that Vikings felt inhuman, unstoppable, unresponsive to injury, indifferent to death. They were wrong. The Vikings were not inhuman. They were conditioned. Their strength did not come from madness, but from systems, built into muscle, breath, and reflex, long before the first blow was ever struck. At the center of it all stood the blacksmith, not merely a craftsman, but a figure who existed between worlds. Half engineer, half shaman. In Viking society, the forge was a place of transformation. Bog iron pulled from wetlands and earth was beaten into steel through repetition, discipline, and an intuitive mastery of heat. Every strike of the hammer refined structure. Every reheating corrected weakness. Pattern welding was not decoration. It was control. Soft iron and hard steel were layered together to balance flexibility and strength, ensuring blades would bend before they broke, especially in cold northern climates. Quenching was the most dangerous moment of all. Too hot, and the blade became brittle. Too cold, and it became useless. Smiths judged temperature by color, by sound, by instinct passed down through generations. Modern metallurgy now confirms what these smiths already knew without equations or microscopes. Their methods worked because they were grounded in observation, repetition, and survival. The weapons endured because the knowledge endured. And this brings us back to the truth we avoided at the beginning. The Vikings did not dominate because they were savage. They dominated because they understood systems. Human systems, mechanical systems, psychological systems. They understood how fear moves through bodies, how pressure breaks formations, how belief sharpens steel. Metal and man were never separate. They functioned as one, and that understanding never truly vanished. It simply went underground, waiting to be remembered. If this changes how you see Viking warfare, let us know. Which weapon revealed the most unexpected intelligence to you? And if you're ready to explore what made their ships just as revolutionary as their weapons, stay with us. This is Dark Origins.